Welcome to Coexisting with COVID-19, where we ask the burning question, are the kids going to be all right? I'm your host, Hanson Hosein, co-founder of the University of Washington's Communication Leadership Graduate Program. This is the UW's Office of Public Lecture special series that brings you credible expertise in a time of crisis. Special thanks to these entities for their support. In this episode, we explore how kids have fared during the pandemic and some best advice to help them emerge from it. We'll hear tonight from our mental health and well-being experts. It's a story of fragility and of resilience. It's also not just about kids, but about parents and caregivers as well. Joining us are Janine Jones, a professor of school psychology and the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the University of Washington's College of Education. Janine's focus is on providing culturally responsive mental health interventions for school-age youth, particularly as it relates to racial diversity and multiculturalism. Jill Locke is the co-director of the School Mental Health Assessments Research and Training, or SMART, Center. She's also an associate professor in the UW's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. Jill's research focuses on youth and autism spectrum disorder and is a licensed child psychologist. And returning from our first season's episode on mental health is Liliana Lengua, the UW's Maritz Family Foundation Professor of Psychology. She's also the director of the Center for Child and Family Wellbeing. Lily studies the effects of adversity on children and how it contributes to their resilience or vulnerability. Most recently, she's taken a closer look at the effects of low income on kids. Do you have questions for our experts? Email anytime during this episode to mayiask@uw.edu. Lily, Janine, and Jill, thank you very much for joining us as this crisis endures.
Thanks for having us.
Lily, I thought we'd start with you since we left off with you back in June of last year. You've been focused on work, all of you have been focused on work with kids who have had to overcome specific challenges and demonstrate incredible resilience even before what we're experiencing right now. How has your specific research around your demographic fared during the pandemic so far?
Yeah, our research is often focused on kids experiencing stress and adversity, especially when kids are in a low-income context or their families are in a low context. And even though we keep talking about this pandemic as we're all in this together, people's experiences are really different. And there are families who are really struggling. We know from research that kids who grow up experiencing economic disadvantage and housing insecurity and food insecurity are particularly more likely to have mental health problems. And so as the pandemic has exacerbated some families' income contexts to be even more insecure, we know that those children are at risk for developing mental health problems. And also, those parents are more likely to be experiencing mental health problems related to stress. One of the biggest predictors of how kids do when there are stressful events in their lives or natural disasters is how moms are doing or parents are doing with their mental health. And so we know parents in this context are experiencing a lot of mental problems or more mental health problems. So, some kids are going to do great and other kids are going to struggle. And so we've been really trying to understand some of those differences.
Given your focus on low-income families, obviously that their situation has been exacerbated by the pandemic, how concerned are you that with the pandemic and the growing unemployment rate and the infection rate and all the other challenges, that this population is actually growing?
Yeah, I think that's a significant concern. What we know from existing research is that children who experience that significant adversity and often more significant adversity associated with low income or poverty, that they can have lifelong impacts, that their social, emotional well-being and their mental health can be impacted through their whole life. And so just as we're learning that the physical impact of COVID, some people are long timers, they're having long-term physical symptoms, we might expect that there are going to be children and families who are going to have long-term impacts. And with a growing number of families experiencing economic insecurity, we anticipate those numbers are going to grow.
Janine, you've heard Lily speak specifically about low-income families. Your work has focused very much on diversity and multiculturalism and youth who come from that specific area. What has been your observation so far in terms of the impact of the pandemic on them?
Well, I've seen a variety of things. I think that school for some BIPOC communities wasn't working optimally before, particularly the individualistic and the competitive norms that were set up in school as the primary way of learning. So some when learning environments weren't really including the cultural norms of youth and the values that they were bringing into the setting, it was not a safe or healthy environment for many BIPOC youth. But now it seems like the pandemic has kind of forced schools to focus on essential needs like food and technology, and the coping of not only the students but also the teachers and the building leaders. And so by kind of paring down some of the fluff, it's our opportunity now to really learn how to enter and center the sociocultural needs of our youth. So for many BIPOC youth, it was an opportunity for them to be in safe context where they could believe in themselves, and they had some of the socialization of their family members to keep building them up. And now, if we keep that going and we keep that centered in our educational environments, it could be better. So
So, so
some
get
better.
so given that the system wasn't necessarily serving these kids before, and we've had to make that change in focus, it sounds like we're learning some lessons as well in terms of how things can be improved upon. So what you're saying is that the kids can be all right. I mean, they're suffering still, but there have been some changes for the better.
Yes, yes.
Okay, well
I think
that's
yeah, one I can see now is that before, many schools weren't really partnering well with their caregivers. So caregivers typically had to initiate contact unless there was a problem. Then schools might reach out because they're complaining or upset or bothered by the behavior of their child. And now I'm seeing that many schools are doing really intentional reaching out to families to try and partner and connect. And I think the pandemic has forced that to happen to enhance engagement.
That's interesting. Well, Jill, with kids with autism, I imagine that you might have a somewhat similar story to tell in terms of things were challenging before, things remain challenging, but maybe things are also showing a way forward.
Yeah, Hanson, I think that there's just been a huge spectrum, just like the autism is a spectrum, right? So we have kids that have autism that are very impacted by their autism and receive their services in schools who aren't getting them right now during this era of COVID. And then we see kids who are on this end of the autism spectrum who may be milder in terms of mildly impacted by their autism, again, still receiving their primary services in schools, but aren't getting them right now. But we have seen just this variety of, kids that are not doing all right as we would hope that they would be given this time. Again, because they're removed from their settings, that the routines that they're used to, they're removed from the services and supports that they typically get and need and receive, and are now experiencing Zoom school or remote learning. And it's a difficult time for them. But then we have the flip side of the coin as well. So other students with autism where school was not such a great place to be physically before the pandemic. And so a lot of those barriers have been removed for those students who experienced a lot more social anxiety in school, experienced a lot more loneliness, and might have been targeted from some teasing and bullying. They're removed from that setting and are doing a little bit better. So I would have to say that overall, we've seen a lot more mental health challenges rise during this time for both our parents and our youth with autism.
When it comes to those very specific challenges, given the stress, how much have you been able to provide any kind of advice in terms of how to even just manage or survive in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're asking a lot of our parents. It's stressful enough to be a parent, and then you add on this layer of autism, which adds to the stress. We know that in the literature. And then we add this layer of remote learning where the parents are now also teachers, which again adds another layer of stress on top of, parents juggling working from home on their own, or other children in the household, or other sort of life events, caring for elders or caring for others impacted by COVID. So there's just an added layer, maybe even a multiplicative layer of stress that keeps building and building during this time. And I think what's been helpful, at least I hope it's been helpful, is that they've been getting some, online support, and there's some toolkits that are available. I'm happy to share them with anyone that emails you, Hanson, and we can pass that on to you. But ways to support our families in that way. But I do have to say, it's a really hard time right now, and what little we're doing is not enough.
Well, obviously we have three experts here who have done very specific work around mental health and well-being when it comes to low-income families, BIPOC youth, and children with autism. But there are also some universalities that any parent or any kids are probably experiencing during this pandemic. Liv, I'm going to try this question with you, but I might put it to everyone as well. What can we extrapolate from these specific instances and these specific groups of kids that might be more of a common experience that every kid is experiencing right now during this pandemic, given the fact that you are so focused on families and well-being?
Yeah, there are commonalities in our experiences. And there have been some plus sides to COVID. Families are reporting spending a lot more time at home. For a while, things slowed down a lot. And I think it helped highlight for families that, not having such a full schedule wasn't such a bad thing. Really appreciating little things. So I think there are some really positive things helping us to be much more present and mindful to the little things in our households and our families and spending time with. And so those have been some of the common experiences. The other things people are really talking about is missing social contact. And so I think that's a very common experience, and more for some than others. Some people are more introverted or not needing as much social contact. But we know that in a study of adolescents that we did, adolescents who were able to sustain some sort of social contact with good friends were faring better. Other common experience is just how different everything is. I mean, we're all just, learning how to do everything differently. Even just learning how to be on Zoom all the time is a totally new experience. We're all learning better technology skills in the process. So I think those common experiences are both pluses and minuses in the COVID.
Jill, I actually want to come to you based on what Lily answered in terms of social context, going back specifically to children with autism. That lack of social contact, how does that play out for that particular group of kids?
Yeah, that's also a great question, Hanson, and I feel like my answer is going to be it depends, right? So we have kids with autism who often struggle with some of these socialization cues and opportunities to socialize, and so when they're in school, they have that opportunity to practice their social skills, to build friendships, and sort of have those repeated social experiences. And again, if they have somebody supporting that, that's how they gain skills and continue to develop and meet some of their goals that might be on their individualized education plans or programs. But then we also have kids who really are anxious and get a lot more anxious when they're around other kids, and school may not have been a comfortable place. I don't know if you've spent much time on a school playground, but it's kind of chaotic, right? It's very noisy, it's unstructured, there's probably 50 to 100 plus kids on the yard at the same time, which makes social distancing hard. So we can talk about what that's going to look like when school goes back to session. But thinking about, that being a very stressful climate for a lot of our students, and having this quieter time at home, and more time to really connect with peers that they want to connect to on Zoom or in other ways, might be a little bit better for them. So I think it really depends on the needs of the students and the kids.
And I know, Jill, you were speaking about kids with autism, but there's such a universality to what you're saying. I'm even concerned about my kids being able to learn how to re-socialize as they make the transition back to school. So that's a really helpful observation. Janine, I think there's a very similar thing to think about when it comes to BIPOC youth and this dual calamity that has happened over the last 12 months in terms of race and social injustice tied to the pandemic, and you can't really separate the two. What can we learn from the experience of the kids that you study in terms of moving forward with that really profound, highly disruptive experience?
Yeah, thanks for the question. What I've been thinking a lot about is how awareness and understanding and feeling a sense of solidarity with other people that have had similar shared experiences has been a powerful part of this very difficult year. And watching adolescents like have an opportunity to be active and kind of push for change and advocate for themselves is something that has come out of it. I've watched even my own child become more politically savvy and also empowered in a way that I think is a very great thing for her as she's moving toward adulthood. And I see the same things with her peers. Like they're having dialogues around race across races in a way that I never did at that age. And so I think that this movement that we are involved in is somehow building power and insight in youth in a way that I would never have expected.
Lily, I want to dig in a little deeper to what Janine was talking about in terms of this notion of solidarity and empathy in terms of what kids have been experiencing, because I know that when I go for a walk now with my kids and we're walking down the sidewalk, even in our neighborhood, if we see somebody coming in our direction, and I am pirating a little bit of this from an earlier conversation I had with Janine, we cross to the other side, and I imagine there are
Mhm.
certain kids who experienced that even before the pandemic. So I'm curious where we could take that solidarity and empathy as we move forward with our kids, even out of the pandemic.
Uh, I feel like exercising the muscle of being able to talk about things that have been uh, what's the word when we can't really talk about it's stigmatized. So like things that we couldn't discuss across races before has become easier, and we have exercised a muscle in a way that I think that we can have cross-racial relationships that allow us all to keep growing and not to marginalize people that have historically been marginalized as much as they have been. And I think that moving forward, that we can't allow ourselves to go backwards. And I believe in our youth. I think our youth are going to be the ones to make things not be the way that it used to be, because we would cycle in our my age, in our days, we would kind of go back and fall back to the original norms. And I think those days are no longer.
I think that's really powerful. Lily, I'm just going to address a question to you from the audience. It says a lot of parents are calling this the lost year. How much do you think there's truth to that statement? I mean, if it is a lost year, what have we lost?
I think a lot of people are feeling that and feeling really worried about their kids. And I think, I've been hearing about, from experts not to, well, we can hear both sides of it. Sometimes we're hearing about the lost academic year and how far behind our kids are going to be. And other times I'm hearing not to worry that much about that. So I can't say too much about the academics. Kids who are going to be in strong settings will catch up. We worry about the kids, the disproportionate or disadvantaged contexts where they're not in a strong academic setting. So again, I do worry about disparities growing bigger. But I don't worry about it as a lost year for our kids' social and emotional development. If other things are stable, when kids are in safe, stable, nurturing environments and their families are there for them, maybe they're not socializing so much. But it wasn't that long ago that socializing with peers wasn't a part of our mental health. It was being family oriented. And in
That's right.
fact, some cultures, family orientation is still the priority.
That's right.
So knowing that we can lean on our families or our extended families or friends that we think of as family in this time, I'm pretty sure most kids, not everybody, some kids are going to struggle, but most kids are going to be okay when their family and their extended family and friends are around them.
Well, Jill, I'm going to move from that to the question of the night, which is this episode's title, and you can either answer in the context of your own work or just speak more generally to what you think as a parent as well. Are the kids going to be all right? And that's obviously looking future facing as the pandemic eventually comes to an end and we're looking at some other future.
No, Hanson, I think I'm an optimist, and I like to think that the answer is yes. kids are really resilient. And like Lily said, if you have all of those pieces in place where you come from a stable home, it's safe at home. We know a lot of kids are not in safe homes, so those kids may not be doing as all right as we would hope. But when we have all these other factors in place, I think it's going to take some time to heal. And I think it's going to take some time to go back to what a normal was and what our new normal will be. But I do think that kids are resilient and they will be okay.
All right. Well, we're getting a couple more questions from the audience, and I'm going to address this first one, which is specifically to Janine, and then the other one I'll look to both you, Lily, and Jill. And they're both looking forward to the transition once we start looking at getting back to school in a more robust way. So with the comments by Dr. Jones, Janine, about how those kids that weren't thriving in school may actually be doing better some ways right now, and that is hope that the schools will learn from this and change the way it does things. How are the schools preparing now for that change when school does go back? Do they actually have the time to analyze, assess, and develop plans for change by the time in-person school resumes? Janine, I know this is you're probably hazarding a guess, Janine, but I don't know if you've heard anything in the pipeline.
Yeah, you're right. It's like by the gossip and the few things that I've learned that districts are doing right now, because I do supervise school psychologists that are serving kids via Zoom, and some are going back. One of the things that they are definitely doing in a lot of our larger districts is figuring out how to center mental health and social emotional learning as kids are coming back, and prioritizing that as a way of making sure that they are having social emotional needs present, and not as the kind of afterthought or the extra or the kind of thing that you think about when there's a problem. Instead, seeing it as a foundation for learning. And I do believe that if all school districts started with that before, as reentry is happening, that will be much easier to create a learning context where the kids are available to learn. So that for one, I know. I do also think that the creativity that teachers have had to put into place to try and teach via Zoom and be engaging and keep kids connected, that some of that will translate to the back to school when we re-enter, that they will have more experiential learning opportunities and socialized learning where there's cooperative experiences, and hopefully in natural environments so they really stick and the kids can take that forward. But the biggest probably is the social emotional learning curriculum and teaching interpersonal skills for kids to be able to reconnect and socialize with each other again in a new way.
I mean, my kids have the good fortune of going to a school where social emotional is actually the competitive advantage of that school, and I think that's really important. But how much is social emotional a skill that most schools are able to apply, or do they actually have to go into some really rapid learning to be able to bring this into the situation? I know, Lily or Jill, do you have any sense of social emotional as a primary competence for most school systems in this country, or at least in Washington State?
I mean, I'll go for it, Lily.
No, go for it.
I was going to say, we just have that emphasis so much at the Smart Center, and, with all the work that we do, is that's at the forefront and the cornerstone. And, I shouldn't say this on a public lecture, but the academics kind of take a back seat to that, because the kids need to be okay first. They have to be ready to learn. They have to know that it's safe. They have to know and feel comfortable that this environment is going to do well for them. And so I think that, like Janine said, the academics will come, but there's some parts of, the social emotional that we need to heal first before we focus on, the academics, which is important. I'm going to go on record and say that.
And Lily, I'm happy to have you further respond to that, because you were going to say something, but the next questions actually might be a good segue as well to allow you to integrate it. From the audience, do you think that departments of education will look at revising existing curriculum standards and grade level configurations with COVID kids in mind? My colleagues are stressed out that students aren't where they should be at this time in the grade they're in now. And that refers a bit more to Jill talking about the academics not being as important. And you can either speak specifically to the question or extend that idea of where we should be going with social emotional moving forward in the curriculum as they return to school.
Yeah, I don't have as much to say about whether academic standards will be changed or expectations. I think it's going to be an important question, and I think we'll just have to see how much kids have been getting through their online school experience. So I imagine they'll be behind, but I also am confident um, that there will be a lot of catching up. So I don't have as much knowledge around the academic area. I was just going to add about social emotional learning. If we could use what, I love Janine's optimism about how this is going to translate into the schools. And if we could use that to really advocate for that, I think we've had a lot of advocacy in the state of Washington and across the country to have SEL be, social emotional learning, be much more heavily emphasized in schools. It wasn't that long ago that only 30% of schools are incorporating social emotional learning into their curriculum or making it an emphasis. So maybe this is the time to advocate for how much more important it is, not just in coming back from COVID, but in supporting our kids' learning long term.
Janine, how quickly could schools or school systems ramp up on getting really good at social emotional, recognizing, as you do, that that's probably the most important thing for them to adopt?
So quickly, I don't know about quickly, but there are lots of districts that are already having say cell curriculum, so social emotional learning curriculum as part of what they do, and there are typically some that are established that they select like a 20-minute section of the day, a couple days a week, where they were doing it beforehand, and now if they trust that this is a core component, they could quickly build it in as core if it expands the amount of time and the number of days a week where the focus is there. There are other, there are plenty of school personnel where their primary focus is on mental health, and it is teachers where it has been their secondary focus when it comes to mental health, because they really have to focus on the academics. And this is an opportunity to really partner with those mental health professionals that are in the school and listen to how do you make it so that it's not just during that designated cell time, but it is also during academic lectures and the time where kids are socializing with each other, where those skills are practiced and reinforced. And so as long as those, that we kind of set a context for that to be a part of instruction, it will be able to be centered. It just can't be extra.
Oh, that's great. Well, we focused a bit in the last few minutes on transitions for schools and school systems for what comes next. Jill, what advice do you have for parents to prepare for their kids to go back to school? My son, who's 10 years old, has obviously been out of school for almost a year, and he's returning next week on a hybrid system. Um, we can't expect miracles. What would be your best advice for parents as they're pushing their kids out the door?
Yeah, I think just knowing what to expect, right? So if you've been in communication with the schools and the teachers, knowing what the new day will look like, knowing how many kids are going to be there, knowing what the new structure is going to be, and practicing some of those things with your kids, I feel like they'll have a lot more success. And for the kids that do have, special needs or autism, using more visuals and a schedule will support sort of their transition back in. And like I said, Hanson, I'm happy to send some resources that we've developed to like a COVID transition kit back to school with your viewers as well. And you can pass that on. And it's meant to be a resource for anyone, for parents, teachers, and children. But I do want to add something to this conversation, that I think what we've learned in this pandemic is how to be flexible. And I think going back to school and transitioning back to school, there's a lot more flexible thinking. There's a lot more flexible instruction. And so infusing social emotional curriculum throughout the day might be something that people are thinking about already, right? And so not just the traditional, let's sit at your desk and be in the classroom for however many hours before you get a 10-minute recess break and then back in, but thinking about how we can maybe do more hands-on education, do more distance learning, or a combination of some, asynchronous learning with synchronous learning, and more projects where we work together in a safe space. But I do think that there's a lot more thinking outside the box happening. And we were able to transition to remote learning rather quickly. It wasn't perfect, but it, happened rather quickly. And I think we're working on, fine tuning it, and maybe that could be an option for, again, some of these students who have been doing better during this time and may not want to go back to sitting at a desk in their classroom.
Well, I think that points the way to my concluding question that I'd love to put to all three of you as we think a few years down the line. And this might require you to put your science fiction hats on and be very speculative, which I know academics and researchers just don't like to do. But we're already seeing hints of, we know that the system was not great. Our education system has incredible challenges. And that was before the pandemic. The pandemic has exacerbated them, but it also might have pointed the way into ways that we have not given ourselves permission to think of as solutions. So, Lily, I'll start with you. A few years from now, what might you anticipate would be different in education or with children, given what we may have learned from this experience?
Yeah, my area isn't education so much. So I would say I can't forecast what is going to happen, but I know what is needed. I know that what has been highlighted to us is families having their basic needs met is paramount. And, how can I hope that the pandemic has highlighted for us that we really can't tolerate anymore having families who worry about feeding their kids or getting health care or worrying about housing. The rent moratoriums or eviction moratoriums have given families some stability, but how will that go on? How can we get to a place where families are having their basic needs met? We know these early experiences of adversity can have lifelong impact for kids. So hoping that the pandemic may lead us to a place where we can't tolerate those things anymore for kids' development. And then really thinking about the critical importance of parents in kids' lives and parent mental health and their parenting, their ability to be nurturing and present. Really thinking about how do we support parents? What do they need to be to where they can be supported around the stresses in their lives, their mental health, and just really be there for their kids.
Well, you hit my curveball of a question out of the park, Lily. So thanks very much for that. And Jill, since Lily mentioned mental health, I thought that'd be a nice transition to you. What might you imagine, either from a kid's point of view or from a school point of view, in terms of what we will have learned and how we will be different a few years from now?
Yeah, Hanson, like I mentioned, I think I'm an optimist. And so I feel like there's going to be a lot of good things that come from this. And I think we've learned how to be a better community to one another and to support one another. I think we've learned how to be, again, a lot more flexible in the way that we teach and the way that we instruct and the way that we listen. I think, what Janine was saying earlier, like the kids are having conversations that we never would have had 10, 20, 30 years ago. And they still keep having those conversations, even though they're difficult. And so that's going to be moving forward, I think, going to change the system, change the way that, our society is. And, again, our kids are going to grow up and they're going to be the ones you're going to be talking to in public lectures soon. And, maybe they'll have a different perspective for you. But I really do think we've learned a lot. And, obviously this pandemic has been horrible in so many ways. But I do think that we've gotten better at connecting, even though it's remote. And I think the important things have really floated to the top. And, Lily hit on some of those things about family and some of those things about mental health and our own well-being. That's all going to come out. And I think in a few years, we'll be a lot better equipped at handling something like this. God forbid something should happen again. But I think we'll be in a much better place. And I think that, everybody's going to hopefully be as resilient as they need to be and continue to plow forward.
I love the challenge you placed at our feet there, Jill. I think 5 years from now, whatever children you have in your lives now will be the guests on this show. Surviving COVID. We've survived COVID.
That's right.
Well, Janine, the last word to you. I mean, so much was structurally broken and is structurally broken, and you have indicated there are some positive things ahead. What would be your best guess about where we might be a few years from now?
So my family has always said, if you speak things into being, that they will be. So I'm just going to say what I want to be. What I would hope is that our children are going to be learning in a socialized environment where it's cooperative learning, working together, just like a collectivistic culture is, where people are not doing things for themselves, but on behalf of others and to support and help others learn. Experiential, that we'll do more of the experiential learning where things are applied and they really can connect with the concepts so that it's meaningful down the line, not just for a test, to pass a test. I hope and believe that our teachers now are right now learning that doing straight lectures at kids and expecting them to get concepts is not the ideal way for our brains to take in information. And so being more creative and using that experiential learning opportunity for kids to apply the knowledge. And we're even changing in higher education and how we're instructing over Zoom, and recognizing that the discussion time is even more important than the time of delivering information. And so I hope that we don't lose that when we get to the other side of this, that we recognize that the way things really stay is when a person gets mastery over material rather than just memorizing to respond to the desires of whoever their instructor is.
Well, when we get to the other side, I love that optimistic view, and yes, we all can sort of see it on the horizon now. So, Janine Jones, Jill Locke, and Lily Lengua, thank you so much for your helpful insights, and to all of you for giving us a glimmer of hope. And join us again next Thursday, January 21st, for Coexisting with COVID-19. No, really, are we there yet? You may have seen Dr. Vin Gupta from the UW's Institute of Health Metric Sciences recently getting vaccinated live on the Today Show. He'll be one of our guests. And UW Medicine's Dr. Helen Chu most recently was awarded Washingtonian of the Year thanks to her work on the Seattle flu study, which identified the first COVID-19 community transmission in the United States. So these two doctors are on the front lines of the pandemic. They'll be sure to have the latest insights on what we need to know and what we need to do now. You can register for the event free of charge at uw.edu/lectures. And feel free to start the conversation with us now by asking one of our guest panelists about their thoughts, how to make it through what seems the last deadly stage of this pandemic. You can email your questions to mayiask@uw.edu. I hope you're all coexisting with COVID-19 to the best of your abilities and resources. I'm Hanson Hosein. Be well and be safe.